Well, hey everybody, welcome back. Thank you for joining us again for our daily Bible reading time. And we're on day 252 of our chronological journey through the Bible in a year. And we're still in the book of Ezekiel, covering chapters 40 and 41 this time. So go ahead and get comfortable. Let's settle in here and let's read together. And it looks like our cat Frankie has joined us here, so if you hear his commentary in the background, it's not inspired. But anyway. All right, let's begin together. The New Temple, chapter 40. In the 25th year of our exile, at the beginning of the year, on the 10th day of the month, in the 14th year after Jerusalem had been captured, on that very day, the Lord's hand was on me, and he brought me there. In visions of God, he took me to the land of Israel and set me down on a very high mountain. On its southern slope was a structure resembling a city. He brought me there, and I saw a man whose appearance was like bronze, with a linen cord and a measuring rod in his hand. He was standing by the city gate. He spoke to me, Ben Adam, son of man. Look with your eyes, listen with your ears, and pay attention to everything I'm going to show you. For you have been brought here so that I might show it to you. Report everything you see to the house of Israel. The wall and outer gates. Now there was a wall surrounding the outside of the temple. The measuring rod in the man's hand was 6 units of 21 inches. Each unit was the standard length plus 3 inches. He measured the thickness of the wall structure. It was 10.5 feet, and its height was the same. Then he came to the gate that faced east and climbed its steps. He measured the threshold of the gate. It was 10.5 feet deep. One threshold was 10.5 feet deep. Each recess was 10.5 feet long and 10.5 feet deep, and there was a space of 8.75 feet between the recesses. The inner threshold of the gate on the temple side, next to the gate's portico, was 10.5 feet. Next, he measured the gate's portico. It was 14 feet, and its jambs were 3.5 feet. The gate's portico was on the temple side. There were 3 recesses on each side of the east gate, each with the same measurements, and the jambs on either side also had the same measurements. Then he measured the width of the gate's entrance. It was 17.5 feet, while the width of the gate was 22.75 feet. There was a barrier of 21 inches in front of the recesses on both sides, and the recesses on each side were 10.5 feet square. Then he measured the gate from the roof of one recess to the roof of the opposite one. The distance was 43.75 feet. The openings of the recesses faced each other. Next, he measured the porch, 105 feet. The distance from the front of the gate at the entrance to the front of the gate's portico on the inside was 87.5 feet. The recesses and their jambs had beveled windows all around the inside of the gate. The porticos also had windows all around on the inside. Each jamb was decorated with palm trees. Then he brought me into the outer court, and there were chambers and a paved surface laid out all around the court. 30 chambers faced the pavement, which flanked the courtyard's gates and corresponded to the length of the gates. This was the lower pavement. Then he measured the distance from the front of the lower gate to the exterior front of the inner court. It was 175 feet. This was the east. Next, the north is described. He measured the gate of the outer court facing north, both its length and width, its 3 recesses on each side, its jambs, and its portico, had the same measurements as the first gate, 87.5 feet long and 43 3/4 feet wide. Its windows, portico, and palm trees had the same measurements as those of the gate that faced east. 7 steps led up to the gate, and its portico was ahead of them. The inner court had a gate facing the north gate, like the one on the east. He measured the distance from gate to gate. It was 175 feet. He brought me to the south side, and there was also a gate on the south. He measured its jambs and portico. They had the same measurements as the others. Both the gate and its portico had windows all around, like the other windows. It was 87.5 feet long and 43 3/4 feet wide. Its stairway had 7 steps, and its portico was ahead of them. It had palm trees on its jambs, 1 on each side. The inner court had a gate on the south. He measured from gate to gate on the south. It was 175 feet. The inner gates. Then he brought me to the inner court through the south gate. When he measured the south gate, it had the same measurements as the others. Its recesses, jambs, and portico had the same measurements as the others. Both it and its portico had windows all around. It was 87.5 feet long and 43 3/4 feet wide. There were porticos all around, 43 3/4 feet long and 8 3/4 feet wide. Its portico faced the outer court, and its jambs were decorated with palm trees. Its stairway had 8 steps. Then he brought me to the inner court on the east side. When he measured the gate, it had the same measurements as the others. Its recesses, jambs, and portico had the same measurements as the others. Both it and its portico had windows all around. It was 87.5 feet long and 43 3/4 feet wide. Its portico faced the outer court, and its jambs were decorated with palm trees on each side. Its stairway had 8 steps. Then he brought me to the north gate. When he measured it, it had the same measurements as the others, as did its recesses, jambs, and portico. It also had windows all around. It was 87.5 feet long and 43 3/4 feet wide. Its portico faced the outer court, and its jambs were decorated with palm trees on each side. Its stairway had 8 steps. Rooms for preparing sacrifices. There was a chamber whose door opened into the gate's portico. The burnt offering was to be washed there. Inside the gate's portico, there were 2 tables on each side, on which to slaughter the burnt offering, sin offering, and guilt offering. Outside, as one approaches the entrance of the north gate, there were 2 tables on one side and 2 more tables on the other side of the gate's portico. So there were 4 tables inside the gate and 4 outside, 8 tables in all, on which the slaughtering was to be done. There were also 4 tables of cut stone for the burnt offering, each 31.5 inches long, 31.5 inches wide, and 21 inches high. The utensils used to slaughter the burnt offerings and other sacrifices were placed on them. There were 3-inch hooks fastened all around the inside of the room, and the flesh of the offering was to be laid on the tables. Rooms for singers and priests. Outside the inner gate, within the inner court, there were chambers for the singers, one beside the north gate facing south, and another beside the south gate facing north. Then the man said to me, "This chamber that faces south is for the priests who keep charge of the temple. The chamber that faces north is for the priests who keep charge of the altar. These are the sons of Zadok, the ones from the sons of Levi, who may approach the Lord to serve him. Next he measured the court. It was square, 175 feet long and 175 feet wide. The altar was in front of the temple. Then he brought me to the portico of the temple and measured the jambs of the portico. They were 8 3/4 feet thick on each side. The width of the gate was 24.5 feet, and the side walls of the gate were 5 1/4 feet. were 5 1/4 feet wide on each side. The portico was 35 feet across and 21 feet deep, and 10 steps led up to it. There were pillars by the jambs, one on each side. Inside the temple, chapter 41. Next he brought me into the great hall and measured the jambs. On each side the width of the jamb was 10.5 feet. The width of the entrance was 17.5 feet, and the side walls of the entrance were 8 3/4 feet wide on each side. He also measured the length of the great hall, 70 feet, and the width, 35 feet. He went inside the next room and measured the jambs at the entrance. They were 3.5 feet wide. The entrance was 10.5 feet wide, and the width of the entrance's side walls on each side was 12 1/4 feet. He then measured the length of the room adjacent to the great hall, 35 feet, and the width, 35 feet. And he said to me, "This is the most holy place." Outside the temple. Then he measured the wall of the temple. It was 10.5 feet thick. The width of the side rooms all around the temple was 7 feet. The side rooms were arranged one above another in 3 stories of 30 rooms each. There were ledges on the wall of the temple all around to serve as supports for the side rooms, so that the supports would not be in the temple wall itself. The side rooms surrounding the temple widened at each successive story, for the structure surrounding the temple went up by stages. This was the reason for the temple's broadness as it rose. And so one would go up from the lowest story to the highest by means of the middle one. I saw that the temple had a raised platform surrounding it. This foundation for the side rooms was 10.5 feet high. The thickness of the outer wall of the side rooms was 8 3/4 feet. The free space between the side rooms of the temple and the outer chamber was 35 feet wide all around the temple. The side rooms opened into the free space, one entrance toward the north and another to the south. The area of free space was 8 3/4 feet wide all around. Now the building that faced the temple yard toward the west was 122.5 feet wide. The wall of the building was 8 3/4 feet thick on all sides, and the building's length was 157.5 feet. Then the man measured the temple. It was 175 feet long. In addition, the temple yard and the building, including its walls, were 175 feet long. The width of the front of the temple, along with the temple yard to the east, was 175 feet. Next, he measured the length of the building facing the temple yard to the west, with its galleries on each side. It was 175 feet. Interior wooden structures. The interior of the great hall and the porticos of the court, the thresholds, the beveled windows, and the balconies all around, with their 3 levels opposite the threshold, were overlaid with wood on all sides. They were paneled from the ground to the windows, but the windows were covered, reaching to the top of the entrance, and as far as the inner temple and on the outside. On every wall around, on the inside and outside, was a pattern carved with cherubim and palm trees. There was a palm tree beside each pair of cherubim. Each cherub had two faces, a human face turned toward the palm tree on one side, and a lion's face turned toward it on the other. They were carved throughout the temple on all sides. Cherubim and palm trees were carved from the ground to the top of the entrance and on the wall of the great hall. The doorposts of the great hall were square, and the front of the sanctuary had the same appearance. The altar was made of wood, 5¼ feet high and 3½ feet long. It had corners, and its length and sides were of wood. The man told me, "This is the table that stands before the Lord." The great hall and the sanctuary each had a double door, and each of the doors had two swinging panels. There were two panels for one door and two for the other. Cherubim and palm trees were carved on the doors of the great hall like those carved on the walls. There was a wooden canopy outside, in front of the portico. There were beveled windows and palm trees on both sides, on the side walls of the portico, the side rooms of the temple, and the canopies. May the Lord bless the reading and study of His Word.